Everybody, thanks for joining us on Wealth Protector TV. I'm Paul Hitchcock with BarthCalderon, and really honored to have our founder and senior managing partner here with us today, Harry Barth. And we're going to get right into this because talking about asset protection, and Harry, you know, our firm's getting a lot of calls from people who are impacted across the country, business owners, property owners. So we just want to hear from you on what is going on in the world of asset protection right now that everybody should know about.
Yeah, I think we'll talk a little bit today about both asset protection and a little bit about estate planning and estate planning opportunities as well.
Okay.
Well, we'd all have to be living under a rock to know that we're not involved in the global pandemic and the impact of the pandemic on businesses, finance, mental state, physical state is unprecedented. And we're also, as a result of this, sailing into uncharted waters. We haven't seen anything like this though since 1917 in the Spanish flu pandemic. So what are the issues though? So whenever we have this, for sure, for all of us, myself included, for you, for all the people that are listening today, the one thing that's for sure is that the future is uncertain. And uncertainty always leads to litigation. We're going to have issues that come about that are unprecedented between employers and employees. We're going to have COVID-related compensation and potential COVID-related damages, and how are those going to be dealt with? We have issues of landlords and tenants. We have tenants that are unable to pay their rent. We have leases that are personally guaranteed and landlords that may not be able to make the mortgage payments or to pay the payments that they have to make in order to maintain the premises. And how is that going to work itself through? We have situations where people have lines of credit at work that are personally guaranteed. And the list goes on and on and on as to all the potential areas, the unknowns of tomorrow. Now, whenever you have unknowns are solved in two different ways. Sometimes they're resolved via legislation. Legislation tries to clarify, present the rules, the new rules, for example, in dealing with the economic injury disaster loans, new rules regarding to the repayment of payroll protection plan loans, which people don't know exactly how they're going to be forgiven and how it's going to be done. But we have legislation, we have regulations, and legislation and regulations ought to serve as a guidepost. But as you know, we're in a politically contentious period of time. And so not necessarily is the state, local, and or federal government working in unison to resolve problems. If you take a look at the leader of the Senate, Mitch McConnell, who turned around and said, you know, it's kind of crazy to, whether you agree with this or not, to bring forth more stimulus legislation that would be helpful for small businesses and people across America without provision to relieve businesses of liability related to this COVID pandemic.
Do you agree with that assessment?
I do, because as an employer ourselves, as an owner of the law firm, there are just so many unanswered questions. And when we have unanswered questions and unprecedented times, not even considering what you might want to consider frivolous lawsuits, when we can't turn to legislation and rules and statutes, we turn to the courts. The courts, because there may be really, is the firm responsible for X? Is the firm not responsible for X? How do we function or not function as a result of this pandemic? So we turn to the courts, and when we turn to the courts, it's done through the use of litigation. Litigation is extremely expensive to try to define the liabilities that come as a result of this pandemic. And so I'm expecting or anticipating a wave of business and personal related litigation. Other examples are, for example, with insurance companies. With insurance companies, many business owner policies have business interruption insurance. Many insurance companies are pushing back and saying, well, you're not covered by that because this is what we call an act of God or force majeure and would not be covered. However, it's not really an act of God, it was an act of the governor that closed down a business. And does that create a governmental imposed lockdown? Does that trigger, for example, the payment by the insurance company for business interruption insurance? Just another unanswered question. So we have a lot of unanswered questions. But I also think that it's a time that we really need to dig down, and we should always be doing this anyway, but we should review everything that we have and how it's held. I think that's absolutely critical. We need to take a look.
Within the parameters of asset protection you're talking about?
Absolutely. And, it was funny. I was at a meeting this morning and we talk about asset protection. And I think that asset protection is a little broader than many people think. Asset protection is extremely broad. And so I'd like to broaden the definition of asset protection in just a moment. So, for example, when one engages in tax planning and planning to pay the minimum amount of legally required taxes, we're protecting assets. When we're doing estate planning, which I'll talk about further in a moment, we're protecting assets. Even when we're doing financial planning, having proper diversification within a portfolio is protecting assets. When we have trademarks and copyrights that are unprotected and we file for trademarks and copyrights, we're protecting that asset from the claims or utilization of others. And then when it becomes property, how do we protect the trademark and copyright itself? So when you think about most of the things that we're doing all the time, when we set up a limited liability company, when we set up a corporation, when we set up a limited partnership, we are protecting assets and they have to be structured and set up properly. So asset protection is actually quite broad and not very, very narrow. We just happen to do it on steroids, and we do it in a way that is quite significant in a total analysis. So I think that now more than ever, and for the next few years to come, as we enter America 2.0, which will look very different and uncharted, that everyone should be taking an opportunity to review the way in which their assets are held, and all those forms of planning that I just talked about should be reviewed very carefully. I think just 1 sec. I think time spent in that area will give bountiful returns to the people that do so. Yes, Paul?
Is it a fair statement to say that asset protection structures and strategies get tested when a creditor is coming after you? It's when they try to break it down. Is that when it kind of the rubber hits the road?
Well, not necessarily. So just because somebody starts a business in the form of a limited liability company, I don't think that's about to have a test. I think a limited liability company, look at the name. It's a company designed to limit liability based upon statute and law. And the question is whether or not we have taken advantage of the laws that exist. So I don't necessarily think that the rubber hits the road when it's being challenged. I think that a challenge is very important. And I'll describe it in default for you, that without planning, our stocks, our bonds, our cash, our real estate, our homes, our life insurance cash values, the list goes on and on and on. Our businesses are highly vulnerable to the claims of creditors. All of us, who are good business citizens and individuals, have purchased insurance. We buy insurance because, life's uncertainties are in such a way that we don't necessarily control all the events that may befall upon our businesses or our families. We buy insurance. We do our best to determine an appropriate amount, not too much, not too little. So the goals of asset protection are to build barriers, to build walls, so that should someone have a challenge, and be it a legitimate challenge, that we can help mitigate to some extent the length, the breadth, and the depth of that challenge, and drive the plaintiff or the creditor to appropriate third-party sources like insurance companies to hopefully be paid. And if the insurance is inadequate, to be able to turn around and settle or mitigate those claims at somewhat less or significantly less than it would have been in the absence of the planning. And so I think that happens a lot, and I think that the purpose is not necessarily to test the structure, like you would say when the rubber hits the road, but to have a competent structures and solution in place that will be there to help mitigate and or settle potential claims. Which brings me to one other point, and that is, we talk a lot about asset protection, but estate planning, of course, is very much a part of asset protection. And we're in a period of time where we have significant estate tax exemptions, but from a couple to their children of $23 million. It's my professional opinion that $23 million is not going to last. That it'll probably at the end of December 2025, it'll return to somewhere around $10 million. And depending upon the political future of our country, it could go down to $7 million and anywhere from 45 to 50% above that. So that gives us right at this moment, a very, very unique opportunity in estate planning in helping to pass assets from one generation to the next. We have a couple of things that have happened. One, interest rates are very low, practically non-existent. Right. Two, values of assets are impacted significantly by the pandemic. Values are sometimes down 30, 40% from what they were even just a few months ago. What a wonderful time to transfer wealth from one generation to another under that $23 million umbrella, and perhaps save a family in the future millions of dollars in taxation. So again, just more opportunities. And I don't mean to say that in a strange way, saying that, well, as we've heard from the politicians, I never waste a good crisis. Right. I think that we're all suffering. I think we're all suffering for all the reasons I said at the beginning of this monologue, so to speak. But I still think that we need to take this opportunity and do the best that we can with it for our family, both in the forms of asset protection, appropriate estate planning, and appropriate tax planning. And another thing that comes to play, it's interesting how these emerged from our broad client base and prospective client base, is that there seems to be a strong interest in moving businesses from one generation to the next at this time. The business values are lower, which makes it easier to do. And I can assure you that many entrepreneurs facing this unprecedented challenge of seeing that, maybe it's time that we start the process in moving my business from one generation to the next, whether it be from two generations of our family, if we have people who are family members who are competent to run and take over a business and bring with the new challenge to new heights, whether it be a transfer to key employees or top management, or it being even prepared, or they say in the real estate market, staged, prepared, painted, and cleaned to get the maximum dollar value being transferred to a third party on the outside. But I think that we need to pull our head out of the sand and think of that succession planning also as a subset of asset protection planning. So I just think that it's a wonderful time to look inside, do some critical thinking, and make sure that our families are protected as best they can be throughout that broad spectrum of various different components that we deal with.
Very fantastic. Great information as always. Really appreciate you taking the time. And for all those listening, thanks for jumping on to this latest episode of Wealth Protector TV. Thanks, Harry.
Thank you, Paul.